There comes a moment when you realize you don't feel like yourself anymore, but not in a dramatic or broken way. Nothing collapsed. Your life didn't fall apart. You're still showing up, still functioning, still doing what needs to be done. And yet, something inside has quietly shifted. Your reactions are slower, more contained. Situations that once pulled emotional responses from you now pass through with less intensity. You notice you don't crave approval the way you used to. Praise feels neutral. Disapproval no longer shakes your core. There's less urgency to explain yourself, less impulse to fix how others perceive you. What unsettles you is not pain, but unfamiliarity. You move through conversations and environments that once felt natural and suddenly they feel slightly misaligned. Not hostile, just off. As if you're standing half a step outside the emotional rhythm you used to follow. You still care, but not compulsively. You still connect, but not automatically. And this creates a strange internal question you can't quite answer. When did this change? There's also a quiet sense of not fully belonging anymore. Not in a lonely way, not with sadness attached, just an awareness that certain dynamics no longer fit. The jokes land differently. The expectations feel heavier. The emotional exchanges that once felt necessary now feel optional. You're not rejecting people, but you're no longer dissolving into them either. This state is confusing because there's no clear problem to solve. Nothing hurts enough to justify alarm. Nothing feels wrong enough to fix. And yet, nothing feels the same. The mind searches for explanations. Am I becoming cold, distant, detached? But none of those labels fully land. What you're experiencing isn't numbness. It's not withdrawal. It's a quiet reorganization happening beneath awareness. And because it doesn't announce itself loudly, it's easy to misinterpret. But this subtle estrangement, this internal distance without bitterness often marks the first moment a person stops orienting their inner world around external regulation. It's the beginning of standing inside yourself rather than leaning outward. If this resonates with you, you're not alone in it, and you don't need to rush to define it. Sometimes awareness comes before language. If this kind of reflection speaks to you, support the channel with a like, subscribe to continue exploring these deeper psychological shifts, and share in the comments whether you've noticed this quiet difference in yourself too. When this internal shift begins, the mind almost immediately turns against it. You start questioning yourself in quiet moments, often without even realizing it. Am I becoming cold? Am I pulling away too much? Am I turning into someone I don't recognize? These questions don't come from clarity, they come from fear. Fear that something essential is being lost. Fear that this subtle distance means you're failing at being human, failing at connection, failing at who you used to be. Because the change isn't dramatic, the mind struggles to categorize it. There's no obvious sadness, no intense anger, no visible breakdown. So it searches for explanations it already knows. It labels the unfamiliar as wrong. It assumes that less emotional urgency must mean emotional damage, that reduced reactivity must mean indifference, that not needing others in the same way must mean disconnection or lack of empathy. This is where the discomfort deepens, not because of what's actually happening inside you, but because of how you're interpreting it. The mind was trained to believe that caring looks like intensity, that love looks like self-sacrifice, that presence requires constant emotional engagement. So when those patterns begin to loosen, the mind sounds the alarm. It tells you something is going wrong, that you're drifting too far, that you should go back to how you were. But confusion does not mean regression. Questioning yourself does not mean you're losing your humanity. It means you've entered a space where old emotional rules no longer apply, but new ones haven't yet been integrated. You're comparing who you are becoming with who you were trained to be, and the gap between the two feels unsettling. This discomfort deserves validation, not correction. Nothing is broken in you for feeling unsure. Nothing is wrong with you for noticing distance where there used to be urgency. The mind simply hasn't caught up to the nervous system yet. And when that happens, uncertainty is inevitable. If you've been quietly asking yourself these questions, pause before judging the answers. There is more happening beneath the surface than the mind can immediately explain. If this perspective resonates, take a moment to like the video, subscribe for deeper explorations like this, and share in the comments which of these questions you found yourself asking lately. What if this sense of being different is not a step backward at all? What if it isn't emotional decline, detachment, or loss, but the first quiet signal that something inside you has expanded? When old reactions fade and familiar patterns no longer fit, the mind quickly assumes something has gone wrong. Yet growth rarely announces itself with clarity or comfort. It often begins as disorientation, as the unsettling feeling that the internal map you've relied on no longer describes the territory you're in. Expansion doesn't always feel like improvement. Sometimes it feels like distance from what once defined you. The roles, emotional reflexes, and attachments that used to organize your inner world start to loosen, not because they failed, but because they've been outgrown. When that happens, the system pauses. It doesn't rush to replace the old with something new. It creates space first. This space can feel empty or confusing, but it isn't hollow. It's transitional. It's the moment between who you were conditioned to be and who you're becoming capable of sustaining without self-abandonment. Feeling different may simply mean you're no longer regulating yourself through others in the same way. The urgency has softened because the center has shifted inward. Seen this way, the change isn't a problem to correct. It's a marker, a subtle sign that your inner structure is reorganizing, making room for a more stable, self-anchored way of being. The version of you that came before was not weak or naive, but it was organized around adaptation. You learned often very early to read the emotional climate of others with precision. You sensed shifts in tone, mood, and energy, and you adjusted yourself accordingly. This ability once felt like empathy, like connection, like care. In reality, it was also a strategy, a way to stay safe, included, and regulated through relationships. Your nervous system relied on proximity, approval, and emotional feedback to feel stable. Connection became the regulator. Distance felt dangerous. Silence felt like threat. So you adapted, softening your edges, explaining yourself, anticipating needs, staying emotionally available even when it cost you. This hypersensitivity wasn't a flaw. It was a survival skill shaped by attachment. But over time, survival can disguise itself as identity. What looked like warmth was often vigilance. What felt like closeness was sometimes self-abandonment. You weren't choosing connection freely. You were maintaining it to stay emotionally balanced. As this pattern begins to dissolve, the contrast becomes clear. The old emotional reflexes no longer activate automatically because your system is learning a different form of regulation. What once felt like love is now recognized as over-adaptation, and that recognition is uncomfortable, not because you're losing connection, but because you're no longer willing to survive at the cost of yourself. Mary Ainsworth's work helps clarify why this internal shift can feel so disorienting. She showed that attachment is not a personality trait and not a fixed identity. It is a strategy the nervous system develops to maintain safety and connection. These strategies form early, long before conscious choice, and they organize how you relate, respond, and regulate emotion. When attachment is insecure, connection becomes a primary source of stability, and relationships carry more weight than they should. What matters is that strategies are not permanent. They evolve when the system no longer needs them in the same way. As internal safety increases, the behaviors that once kept you regulated begin to relax. You don't cling as tightly. You don't scan as constantly. You don't adjust yourself as automatically. This can feel like loss, but it is actually reorganization. The transition toward greater emotional security is subtle. It doesn't feel like confidence or empowerment at first. It feels like unfamiliar calm, reduced urgency, and emotional space where there used to be tension. Through Ainsworth's lens, feeling different is not detachment. It is the nervous system learning that safety no longer depends on constant connection, and that shift is one of the earliest signs of internal stability forming. As internal expansion takes place, the patterns that once governed your relationships begin to lose their force. Dynamics that felt natural for years suddenly feel unnecessary, or even draining. You notice that you no longer feel compelled to manage other people's emotions or maintain harmony at your own expense. The reflex to please weakens not out of indifference, but because it no longer feels essential for your inner balance. Along with this shift comes a quiet reduction in the need to explain yourself. You stop rehearsing justifications. You feel less urgency to be understood, approved of, or validated. What once felt like responsibility now feels optional, and this change can be deeply unsettling, because so much of your identity was built around being responsive, adaptable, and emotionally available. When those reflexes dissolve, it can feel as though a familiar version of you has disappeared. You recognize your values, but not the old behaviors. You care, but without the same self-erasure. This creates the sense of, I'm not who I used to be, even though nothing has been taken away. What's actually happening is a collapse of an outdated pattern, one that kept you connected, but also kept you constrained. The discomfort comes from losing the structure that once defined you, even as something more stable quietly takes its place. What you are in now is not an ending, and it is not yet a beginning. It is an intermediate phase, a space between structures where the old way of relating has loosened and the new one has not fully formed. This in-between state often feels unstable because the nervous system is reorganizing itself without familiar reference points. The signals that once guided your reactions are quieter, and the absence of urgency can feel like emptiness when it is actually recalibration. This is an identity transition, not because your values have changed, but because the mechanisms that supported them are shifting. You are no longer operating from automatic attachment responses, yet you haven't fully embodied a new internal anchor. That gap can feel disorienting, as if you're floating without a clear role or emotional position. What's important to understand is that nothing essential has been lost. Your sensitivity is still there. Your capacity to feel, care, and connect remains intact. What has faded is the dependence on external cues to regulate your inner state. The system no longer needs constant reassurance to stay balanced. This phase doesn't ask you to become harder or more distant. It asks you to tolerate not knowing who you are for a moment, while your nervous system learns a quieter, more self-sustained way of being. Think of this process like wearing clothes that once fit you perfectly. For a long time they felt comfortable, familiar, and right. But now, without anything tearing or breaking, they simply feel tight. The fabric pulls where it didn't before. The movement is restricted. Nothing is wrong with the clothes themselves. They just no longer match the shape you've grown into. Trying to squeeze back into them only creates discomfort. Or imagine speaking a language you once mastered, only to realize it no longer captures what you're experiencing. The words are familiar, but they feel imprecise. You search for expressions that don't exist yet. It's not that you've forgotten how to speak, it's that your inner reality has outgrown the vocabulary you used to describe it. The same is true emotionally. The inner structures that once held you, your roles, reactions, and relational habits, were built for a smaller version of you. As you expand internally, those structures begin to feel cramped. The sense of being different arises not because you've lost something, but because the container no longer fits what you're becoming. Growth rarely feels like addition at first. It feels like outgrowing what once kept you safe. At this stage, one of the most common mistakes is trying to return to who you were before. The mind looks for familiarity and assumes that discomfort means something must be corrected. So you may try to force old behaviors back into place, being overly available, emotionally expressive, or accommodating in ways that no longer feel natural. This isn't healing. It's self-sabotage disguised as responsibility. Another trap is performing empathy, instead of allowing it to arise organically. You push yourself to react, to feel, to respond the way others expect, even when your system is asking for space. This kind of performative connection drains energy and creates internal conflict, because it requires you to override your current state to maintain an outdated image of yourself. Reactivating relationships that depend on self-abandonment has a similar effect. You step back into dynamics that require you to shrink, explain, or regulate others emotionally. In the short term, this may reduce anxiety. In the long term, it leads to confusion, exhaustion, and emotional regression. The body knows when something no longer fits. Ignoring that signal doesn't restore connection. It pulls you away from the internal stability that's trying to form. What this phase asks of you is the opposite of what you were taught to do. Instead of reaching outward to repair, explain, or reconnect, it invites you to pause. There is no need to force connection when your system is learning to stand on its own. Trying to recreate closeness before internal stability has settled only recreates the old patterns that are dissolving. You are not required to explain your change to everyone around you. Language often lags behind internal shifts, and premature explanations tend to distort what is actually happening. When you try to define the transition too quickly, you reduce it to something manageable, something familiar, and in doing so, you interrupt its natural integration. This process cannot be accelerated. Expansion unfolds in the nervous system, not in the intellect. Effort doesn't help here. It interferes. What's needed is the capacity to hold the unfamiliar without rushing to fix it. Sustaining this space, without filling it, performing, or justifying, is how the new internal structure takes root. Growth at this level is not something you do. It's something you allow by not pulling yourself back into forms you've already outgrown. As you stop forcing old patterns, a new internal quality begins to surface quietly. There is more inner silence, not the heavy silence of suppression, but a spacious one. Thoughts slow down. Emotional waves still arise, but they no longer pull you under. You notice feelings without being immediately compelled to act on them. This creates a sense of neutrality that can feel unfamiliar if your identity was built around constant emotional movement. Reactivity softens. Situations that once triggered immediate responses now create a pause. In that pause, awareness grows. You observe rather than absorb. You listen without dissolving into what you hear. This doesn't mean you care less, it means you're no longer overwhelmed by what you care about. From the outside, this can be mistaken for coldness. From the inside, it feels like stability. Your nervous system is learning to regulate itself rather than outsourcing regulation to relationships or reactions. Emotional presence becomes quieter, but more grounded. What's emerging is not detachment, but a capacity to stay connected without losing yourself. This is not emotional withdrawal. It's the formation of internal safety, where feeling no longer requires urgency to be real. For a long time, you may have believed that being constantly available was a moral strength, that responding quickly, giving endlessly, and staying emotionally open at all times meant you were kind, mature, or loving. Intensity was confused with depth. Adaptation was mistaken for devotion. These ideas were never questioned because they were praised, reinforced, and rewarded in your relationships. But as your system settles, another truth becomes visible. Always being available often meant ignoring your own limits. Feeling everything intensely wasn't emotional wisdom. It was nervous system overload. Constant adaptation didn't come from love alone. It came from the fear of losing connection. Many of the behaviors once labeled as emotional richness were actually signs of hyperactivated attachment. This realization can feel unsettling because it challenges an identity you were proud of. Yet maturity does not require emotional exhaustion. Love does not demand self-erasure. True connection doesn't depend on endless availability or dramatic feeling states. As these myths dissolve, what remains is a quieter, more honest form of presence, one that values regulation over intensity, choice over compulsion, and stability over performance. At some point, There is a small but decisive moment of recognition. You notice that you've stepped back from a situation or a person, and the guilt that once followed simply doesn't arrive. There is no rush to explain, no impulse to repair, no fear that something essential has been lost. Instead, there is calm. Not relief, not excitement, just steadiness. You also realize that the urgency you once felt around connection is gone. The need to reach out, to be seen, to secure the bond has softened. Connection is still possible, but it's no longer compulsory. And perhaps most surprisingly, you notice that in interactions you no longer disappear inside the other person. Their emotions don't consume you, their reactions don't define you. You remain present without dissolving. For a moment, this absence of urgency can feel like emptiness. But as you sit with it, something becomes clear. Nothing is missing. What you're experiencing is not detachment, but presence. An internal anchor has formed where external regulation used to be. You are with others without leaving yourself. And that quiet continuity, that ability to remain whole, is not loss. It's integration. This phase asks for patience more than understanding. There is no need to name what you're experiencing too quickly or to search for labels that make it easier to explain. Language can rush the process, forcing clarity, before the system has fully settled into its new organization. When you try to define the shift too soon, you risk shaping it around old frameworks that no longer fit. There is also no obligation to explain yourself to everyone around you. Not every change needs to be justified or shared. Some transitions require privacy so they can stabilize without interference. When you over-explain, you invite others' expectations and interpretations into a process that is still forming. Integration follows. The rhythm of the nervous system, not the intellect. The mind wants conclusions, timelines, and meaning. The system needs time, repetition, and safety. Remaining with the experience, without forcing insight or resolution, is what allows it to consolidate. This is not avoidance. It's respect for a deeper process that unfolds quietly, at its own pace, when it's not being pushed to perform or make sense. Feeling different is not a sign that you are withdrawing from life or losing your capacity to connect. It is the first indication that connection is no longer the axis around which your inner world revolves. For a long time, your sense of stability may have depended on proximity, approval, and emotional exchange. Now, something more central has taken shape. You are no longer organizing yourself around the bond. You are organizing from within. This shift can be misread as distance, especially by those who knew you through your availability and adaptation. But what is actually happening is a redistribution of energy. What once flowed outward by default is now rooted inward by choice. You are still capable of closeness, but you no longer need it to define you. Feeling different is the marker of this change. It signals that your center has moved, not away from others, but toward yourself. This is not isolation. It is not emotional shutdown. It is a quiet expansion that doesn't announce itself loudly. An internal widening that allows connection to exist without control, urgency, or self-loss. What you're experiencing isn't less life. It's life reorganized around a deeper, more stable core. There is no final instruction here, no promise that everything will suddenly feel clear or comfortable. What you are in does not come with guarantees, timelines, or a neat resolution. And that is intentional. Some inner shifts are not meant to be turned into goals or destinations. They are meant to be lived through quietly, without the pressure to arrive somewhere else. You may notice the mind still asking, where is this leading? What am I becoming? When will this settle? But this process does not respond to those questions. It unfolds beneath them. Trying to extract meaning too quickly only pulls you back into the habit of controlling what needs to mature on its own. Not every transformation announces itself with relief or certainty. Some unfold as a steady absence of urgency, a growing tolerance for not knowing, a deeper comfort with simply being present inside yourself. You are not required to feel better to validate what is happening. You are not required to be inspired, motivated, or emotionally elevated. This phase is not about improvement. It is about stabilization, about learning to stay with yourself without reaching outward for reassurance or explanation. The silence you're experiencing is not empty. It is functional. It is holding something together while it reorganizes. Nothing needs to be fixed right now. Nothing needs to be concluded. You are allowed to move through your days without extracting lessons from every feeling, without turning this moment into a narrative. Some changes are not meant to be spoken about while they are forming. They ask for containment, not interpretation. If this message resonates, take a moment to support the channel by liking the video. Subscribe if you want to continue exploring these quieter psychological transitions without noise or urgency. And if you feel called to, share in the comments whether you're learning to sit with change rather than explain it. Sometimes simply recognizing that is enough.